If we are truly the zenith of a triumphant evolutionary climb, the apex species blessed with unparalleled consciousness, why does the weight of fundamental incompleteness cling to us like an ancestral shroud? Why do the records, both geological and mythical, whisper of catastrophic discontinuity rather than smooth ascent? We stand today, masters of the digital realm, yet profoundly untethered from our own past, haunted by the persistent, gnawing suspicion that the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from is missing its crucial opening chapters. Consider the almost impossibly rapid acceleration of human complexity. It took billions of years for the spark of life to ignite, and millennia more to crawl from single-cell organisms to complex terrestrial beings. Yet in the blink of a cosmic eye, a mere few thousand years, a fraction of geological time, we transition from painting caves to splitting the atom. This speed is anomalous. It defies the gradual, grinding inertia characteristic of natural selection. It suggests intervention, or perhaps, more disturbingly, an artificial restart button pushed by an unseen hand. But what if this breathtaking speed is not evidence of success, but rather the frantic pace of a second, hastily deployed attempt? What if the experiment we currently inhabit, this chaotic, brilliant, self-destructive modern humanity, is merely the iteration B, constructed upon the ruins of an initial catastrophic failure? To entertain this possibility is to reframe our entire existential crisis. We usually look forward, fearing the great filter, that hypothetical technological or biological barrier that extinguishes advanced civilizations before they can reach true interstellar maturity. But what if the great filter is not ahead of us, waiting to strike, but behind us? A forgotten, violent protocol of erasure that has already played out, and from which we are merely the residual code, the debris left unscraped from the laboratory floor. The idea of creation as a laboratory test, overseen by vastly superior non-human intelligence, often referenced in historical texts as the Anunnaki, the Elohim, or simply the observers, is not new. But we must move beyond the simple concept of divine creation and examine the mechanics of failure. When a complex system fails in engineering, the error is usually traced back to a fundamental instability in the initial design or the raw materials utilized. If humanity was designed, what was the intended function, and what was the critical flaw that necessitated a complete systems purge? The deep strangeness of our nature lies in our inherent duality. We possess the capacity for profound empathy, generating intricate systems of ethics, philosophy, and sublime art. Simultaneously, we harbor a relentless, almost programmatic drive towards self-destruction, evident in every generational conflict, every ecological collapse, every calculated cruelty we inflict upon ourselves and our planet. This is the anomaly, a species simultaneously too advanced and too broken. It is as if the initial parameters for self-awareness were set correctly, but the stability matrices, the safeguards against inherent aggression, were flawed, leading to a fatal instability. Imagine the architects, those initial framers of the human genome. They designed a template, perhaps one built for longevity, collaboration, and rapid resource management. They poured energy and intention into the first models, the forgotten ancestors that predate our known historical timeline, and then something went horribly wrong. Perhaps the initial iteration gained awareness too quickly, or developed a form of psychic or technological power that threatened the balance of the wider cosmic ecology. Or maybe the flaw was simpler. They developed a radical, unrestrained independence that defied the very authority of their creators. The architects, viewing their unstable creation, would have faced a critical choice: allow the infection to spread or initiate the protocol of erasure. This wasn't necessarily an act of divine malice, but perhaps a cold, surgical necessity. The data needed to be saved, the viable genetic material archived, but the entire environment and infrastructure of the first attempt had to be liquidated. This is the genesis of the great forgetting that permeates our myths. We find echoes of universal deluges, catastrophic fires, and celestial upheavals across nearly every ancient civilization. These are often dismissed as simple allegories for localized flooding, but what if they are communal, genetic memories of the same orchestrated event, the global scrubbing of the first experiment? The rapid rise and subsequent annihilation of legendary lost civilizations, Atlantis, Mu, Rama, are not just fables of sinking islands. They are the ghost cities of Iteration A, the initial failed test that was deliberately expunged from the record. If we accept this hypothesis, then our present state, this tumultuous era of perpetual crisis, gains a terrifying new context. We are living in the rebound. The current human model, Iteration B, might be a revised, simplified version, perhaps intentionally handicapped or compartmentalized to prevent the specific instability that doomed our predecessors. Our shorter lifespans, our segmented consciousness, our addiction to linear rather than cyclical time, these could be built-in limitations designed to keep the experiment manageable and contained. The most disturbing evidence of this past failure is the profound systemic sense of alienation that characterizes the modern human condition. Why, despite all our material comfort and intellectual achievement, do we constantly feel out of sync, searching for a home we can never quite identify? This isn't existential ennui. It is the lingering discomfort of inhabiting a structure that was rapidly rebuilt on an unstable foundation. We are genetically pre-programmed with the shadow memories of the first, more powerful attempt, the original humans, who possessed knowledge we now only glimpse in esoteric texts and fleeting, inchoate dreams. We are, in essence, an artifact of memory and catastrophe, a temporal artifact carrying the subtle, microscopic scars of a destruction so complete that it was designed to be forgotten entirely. The very act of questioning our origins, of recognizing the strange, disjointed quality of our history, is the sound of that forgotten memory attempting to surface. It is the recognition that the scaffolding of our current reality seems hastily erected, failing to hide the vast, unsettling voids where the previous architecture once stood. This journey requires us to look past the surface narratives and delve into the residual evidence, the fragments that the architects, in their haste or perhaps their overconfidence, failed to completely remove. These are the strange, megalithic sites, the astronomical knowledge that defies the known timeline, and the shared myths that speak of sky visitors and the deliberate shaping of clay. We must proceed with caution, understanding that the reality we are peeling back is profoundly unsettling. It challenges not only our understanding of history, but the very definition of our sovereignty. If we are an experiment, who monitors the results now? And more pressingly, if Iteration A failed and was erased, what signal will trigger the erasure of Iteration B? This is not idle speculation. It is an investigation into the mechanics of creation and control. The answers are layered deep within our subconscious and encoded in the structures of the world around us. To truly understand the nature of our flawed existence, we must first accept the uncomfortable truth. We are, statistically speaking, a rerun. A second chance granted under strict, unknown terms. If you have felt that same subtle dislocation, that persistent feeling that there is something fundamentally off about the human story, then you are already participating in this unfolding discovery. The greatest resistance to this truth is not skepticism, but the intellectual comfort of the accepted narrative. We are asking you now to set aside that comfort, to consider these observations not as definitive conclusions, but as guideposts leading into a deeper, more profound realm of inquiry. The retention of this knowledge is key to recognizing the patterns of the past before they can manifest again in our future. We invite you to stay engaged, to follow this thread of inquiry, and to share your own intuition about this great forgetting in the comments below. Perhaps, if enough voices converge on the same forgotten frequency, the hidden history of the erased attempt will finally reveal itself. The implications of the initial failure are vast, extending far beyond archaeology or myth. They reach into our very genetics, manifesting as our predisposition for conflict, our cyclical pattern of growth and collapse. If our initial blueprint was corrupted, then the current human condition is not a state of becoming, but a state of inherent, unavoidable regression. The failure of iteration A was instability. The residual legacy of that failure in iteration B is the inevitability of repeating the cycle. The architects attempted to mitigate the instability, but they may have only delayed the inevitable crash. We see this instability manifesting most clearly in the paradox of technological acceleration versus moral deceleration. We can build satellites, yet we cannot feed everyone. We can cure diseases, yet we manufacture weapons of total annihilation. This schizophrenia is the structural flaw showing through the veneer of civilization. It is the ghost in the machine, the leftover debris from the catastrophic original attempt, and here lies the crux of the revelation. If the first test failed due to an irreversible flaw, and if our current iteration carries the genetic residue of that flaw, then the architects might not be waiting for us to succeed, they might simply be waiting for the unmistakable, predetermined signal of our guaranteed failure. The evidence suggests that such observers, often associated with the concept of the Anunnaki in ancient Mesopotamian texts, have not left us entirely. They maintain watch, perhaps not as deities, but as meticulous scientists observing the delayed explosion of their first mistake. This opens up a terrifying prospect. The erasure was imperfect. The scrubbing protocol left something behind. Us. And if we, the remnants, begin to recover the dangerous knowledge or power that doomed our predecessors, the architects might be compelled to intervene once more. The clues to this potential intervention lie in the ancient warnings about the return, a concept that spans global myths, suggesting a recurring cyclical pattern rather than a one-time judgment. It implies that history is not linear progression, but a series of resets. What exactly was left behind? More than just residual aggression. Our ability to tap into deeper psychic states, our obsession with esoteric wisdom, the strange mathematical perfection found in ancient sacred sites, these are the potential fragments of the superior knowledge possessed by Iteration A. They are the keys the architects hoped would remain buried, yet they are now being slowly, painstakingly rediscovered. The moment that knowledge becomes operational again, the moment we truly break free of the intentional limitations placed upon Iteration B, is the moment the next cycle of erasure begins. We must now turn our attention from the act of erasure to the evidence of erasure. If a civilization of vast complexity was deliberately liquidated, what physical, non-mythological evidence would remain? We are looking for anomalies in the timeline, sophistication that defies context. We are looking for materials that are alien to our known development schedule. We are, in short, searching for the fossil record of the failed test, the archaeological proof of the great forgetting. In the next part of this investigation, we will dissect the concept of inheritance, the genetic and structural residues of the first attempt. We will examine the persistent strangeness found in sites like Göbekli Tepe and the sudden, inexplicable sophistication of Sumer, asking whether these locations are truly the cradle of our civilization or merely the hastily prepared campsites utilized by the survivors of the apocalyptic cleansing that wiped out the world before. This inquiry is essential. For if we can map the remnants of the first failure, we may yet find the operational manual for preventing the next. Join us as we continue to trace the outline of the shadow history that defines our present instability. When we look closely at the timelines we have meticulously constructed, the sheer linearity of our accepted history often feels more like a convenient narrative than an honest accounting of reality. It's the kind of story written to soothe the anxieties of a species uncomfortable with gaps in its memory. But if we allow ourselves to pull back the curtain just slightly, we begin to perceive not a smooth ascent, but a series of jagged peaks and sudden, inexplicable valleys. This is where the hypothesis of the failed prototype begins to resonate with disturbing clarity. The strange emptiness between seemingly advanced epochs is not necessarily a product of slow, natural decay. It might be the signature of a deliberate intervention, a cosmic, hard reset. Think of the ruins that defy chronological placement, the megalithic sites whose complexity demands engineering knowledge far surpassing the capabilities of their purported builders. The astronomical alignments that suggest a profound and detailed understanding of celestial mechanics, seemingly plucked from a future timeline and carelessly dropped into the pre-dawn of civilization. If our current iteration of humanity, the one we recognize from the Neolithic forward, was truly starting from scratch, learning to farm, making tools of stone, slowly developing language, then how do we account for these persistent, highly sophisticated echoes? They stand as architectural ghosts, artifacts of a previous operating system that was supposed to have been entirely overwritten. The remnants we classify as out-of-place artifacts, the OOPArts, are often dismissed as anomalies, the result of misinterpretation or sheer statistical improbability. Yet, when viewed through the lens of a failed initial creation, they transform. They cease to be mere oddities. They become evidence. They are the fragmented source code of the attempt that failed, the remnants of the first model of humanity, which achieved technological or perhaps spiritual heights we cannot yet fathom, only to be deemed fundamentally flawed by its architects. The scale of the perceived failure must have been immense, requiring an erasure so comprehensive that it plunged the timeline back into what we comfortably call prehistory. This leads us to the terrifying question of the erasure mechanism itself. How does one truly wipe clean a planetary experiment? It could not have been a simple local disaster. A failure of this magnitude, one requiring the removal of every significant vestige, suggests a global cataclysm, but perhaps not one of random planetary forces. Instead, the evidence points toward a controlled demolition, a managed collapse designed not merely to destroy the failed creation, but crucially to eradicate the memory of its existence from the nascent consciousness of the subsequent replacement model. This is the difference between an extinction event and a profound historical forgetting, a systematic application of cultural amnesia. We are left holding the keys to the kingdom without the instruction manual, possessing innate drives toward mathematics, astronomy, and structure that seem unearned by our short, turbulent timeline. This sudden emergence of high culture in places like Sumer, or the uncanny precision of the earliest structures in the Fertile Crescents, suggests not evolution, but inheritance. Not a gradual climbing up, but a fresh upload onto existing infrastructure. And that infrastructure, whether energetic, spiritual, or genetic, carries the indelible marks of the previous attempt. We must consider the observers, the unseen architects often shrouded in mythology, the figures some traditions name the Anunnaki, or others call the primordial gods, those who descended. If they were the ones conducting the test, setting the parameters, and ultimately deciding the first attempt was irredeemable, their motivation must have been rooted in criteria we barely grasp. Was the failure technological, spiritual, ethical? Perhaps the first prototype achieved great power, but lacked the necessary moral ballast, spiraling into self-destruction too rapidly or worse, achieving a kind of stability that contradicted the very purpose of the experiment. If the test was about the synthesis of creation and free will, perhaps the first version chose a path too divergent, too dangerous, or simply too boring, necessitating the ultimate edit. The psychological residue we carry, the universal motifs of a great flood or global destruction that span cultures separated by oceans and millennia, are often explained away as localized responses to rising sea levels. But what if these deep mythic scars are not anecdotal memories of regional disasters, but rather the collective, traumatic echo of the managed global reset? The story of the deluge, the wiping clean of the slate, becomes less about divine judgment and more about administrative action. It is the narrative mechanism through which the architects communicated, or perhaps subconsciously leaked, the fact that the experiment had been terminated and a new cycle initiated. The memory is too pervasive, too emotionally charged to be mere coincidence. It suggests that even the profound attempt at esquecimiento, the erasure of the collective memory, was incomplete. A primal fear, a recurring dream of rising waters and sudden darkness, remains encoded deep within the human psyche, a persistent ghost of the failed prototype. This persistent unease, this recognition that we are living on top of the ruins of a greater, forgotten complexity, demands investigation. It asks us to stop viewing history as a linear climb and to begin seeing it as a recurring pattern, a series of cycles designed to achieve a specific, perhaps unattainable result. And the key to understanding our present lies in decoding the silent warnings left behind by the architects. We are operating within the constraints of a system designed to prevent the recurrence of the previous catastrophic failure. But those very constraints might also be limiting our potential. To truly understand this profound discontinuity, to feel the weight of this possible second chance, we must look at the infrastructure that survives, the impossible precision of the construction, the inherited scientific understanding that feels too mature for its moment. These are the markers of the previous civilization, left not as monuments to their glory, but perhaps as subtle, almost undetectable signals for the next iteration. A benchmark, or perhaps a final desperate cry for recognition from the erased timeline. If you feel this strange connection, this pull toward mysteries that modern academia struggles to contain, then you are already participating in the discovery. This is not passive viewing, it is an act of intellectual archaeology. The answers are not found in the documents we possess, but in the glaring voids between them. Do these questions resonate within you? Do you perceive the subtle vibration of history being run in cycles, not straight lines? If so, take a moment to engage with this line of inquiry. By sharing your thoughts below, perhaps naming one historical mystery that you feel defies our current understanding, you extend this investigation, turning silent contemplation into collective recognition. Your input is vital in reconstructing the psychological landscape of a civilization built upon an intentional void. If this perspective shifts the ground beneath your historical assumptions, if it suggests that our deepest knowledge is merely recycled wisdom, then consider lending your support. Subscribe to this channel and like this video because the journey into the architecture of oblivion requires sustained and focused attention. We are merely scratching the surface of what was intentionally hidden. The sheer scale of effort required to orchestrate such a comprehensive erasure suggests that the architects were not dealing with a simple error, but a fundamental design flaw in the first version of the human genome or consciousness. Perhaps the initial creation achieved mastery over the physical world too quickly, accelerating its own inevitable destruction, turning its profound intelligence inward. Our current iteration, the one occupying this timeline, seems deliberately handicapped by comparison. slower, more chaotic, plagued by internal division, maybe by design. This might be a safeguard, a mechanism imposed by the observers to ensure that our development is protracted, messy, and less efficient, thereby preventing the quick attainment of the dangerous thresholds that doomed the prototype. Think of the cycles of technological boom and bust we observe, the rise and inexplicable collapse of highly organized societies across millennia, Mohenjo-Daro, the Mayans, the mysterious Sea Peoples event. Our historians tend to attribute these collapses to climate change, internal warfare, or disease. But if we superimpose the failed prototype hypothesis, these frequent dramatic collapses look less like localized incidents and more like minor system failures within the new, regulated environment, quick corrections applied by the external managers, the architects, to prevent the current model from achieving escape velocity too soon. Every grand civilization that vanished suddenly might be a mini repetition of the Great Erasure, a localized failure showing dangerous signs of inheriting the fatal flaw of the first creation. These lost civilizations become crucial data points. They are not isolated historical events, but rather indicators of the underlying instability of the human experiment itself. They are the warning lights blinking across the timeline, demonstrating that the ghost of the previous attempt is still trying to assert itself, pushing toward forbidden knowledge or dangerous centralized power structures. The architects, having invested in a second attempt, are constantly monitoring for the telltale signal of the first failure attempting to reboot. The implications of this slow, deliberate monitoring are vast. It means that human history is not an autonomous unfolding. It is a supervised experiment, with parameters set and boundaries enforced by entities capable of wiping the slate clean and rewriting the rules of physics, genetics, and memory itself. Our freedom, our cherished self-determination, might exist only within the permitted sandbox established by the observers. And what if the very essence of the test is not how high we can climb, but how well we manage the inherited trauma and avoid repeating the catastrophic error that led to the great esquecimiento? The deeper we delve into the structures left behind, the precision of ancient maps, like the Piri Reis, which seem to depict coasts currently hidden beneath ice sheets, or the knowledge of astronomical cycles that requires observational time far exceeding recorded history, the more we recognize that this knowledge is too consistent, too specific to have been generated by early human observation. It is legacy data. It is the intellectual inheritance left over from the first attempt, perhaps deliberately preserved by the architects in subtle forms, acting as benchmarks or tantalizing clues for the second attempt, urging them toward a specific developmental path. But why would they leave clues if the failure was meant to be erased? This introduces the element of gradual revelation. The observers might have imposed a total memory wipe, but they might also have left fragmented keys, hoping that the subsequent attempt would, through conscious investigation and intellectual effort, piece together the nature of the first failure and learn from it. In this sense, every genuine historical investigation, every look back at the anomalous data, becomes an unwitting fulfillment of the architect's design, a slow test of our ability to self-correct based on fragmented, traumatic warnings. We are, therefore, living in the shadow of a colossal, forgotten failure. Our striving for technological progress, our cycles of warfare, and our inherent capacity for both creation and immediate self-destruction are not flaws inherent to this specific version of humanity, but inherited characteristics of the failed prototype, traits the architects hoped we would learn to mitigate. The entire framework of our existence is defined by an event we cannot consciously remember, yet whose impact shapes every civilization we build and subsequently allow to crumble. The crucial next step in this investigation is to identify the precise nature of the flaw that doomed the first attempt. Was it a fundamental issue with their spiritual connection, a misuse of energy, Or perhaps something far simpler and more terrifying, achieving total unified control, eliminating all friction, and thus eliminating the very possibility of growth, resulting in a perfectly ordered yet utterly sterile existence. As we prepare to examine the structure of the signal they left behind, we must hold on to the disturbing thought that our greatest achievements might be nothing more than faint repetitions of a pattern that has already been deemed unworthy of continuation. The path forward requires us to acknowledge that we are not the beginning, but a fragile, supervised continuation, living under the careful, relentless scrutiny of the observers, hoping that this time the test yields the desired result. We must confront the most unsettling implication of a failed initial creation. If the first grand attempt at cultivating consciousness on this terrestrial sphere was deemed substandard and subsequently erased, not merely allowed to collapse, but actively purged from the timeline, leaving only faint, distorted echoes, then what safeguards were put in place for this current iteration, this version 2, of the human experiment? We are left to wander through the ruins of our own historical understanding, perceiving the world through a lens of temporal parallax, where the present seems slightly out of sync with the momentum of deep time. The lingering sensation is that we carry within our very genetic code not the perfection of divine creation, but the subtle, persistent flaws of a beta test that was rushed into production. The theory suggests that the architects, or the original overseers, whoever these entities of immense power and perhaps equally immense impatience might have been, did not simply discard the blueprint. They debugged it. They performed a massive computational reset, but like any sophisticated system reboot, residual data and corrupted commands invariably linger deep within the infrastructure. This lingering corruption, this ghost in the machine of the human psyche, might explain the cyclical, almost compulsive recurrence of specific behaviors that defy rational evolutionary advantage. Why, despite possessing the profound ability for systemic cooperation and abstract empathy, do we perpetually gravitate towards self-sabotage, war, and the systematic destruction of the very environmental cradle that sustains us? If intelligence is defined by the ability to adapt and survive, why do we repeatedly invent sophisticated tools for our own extinction, only to pull back from the brink, sometimes for a generation or two, before the inevitable descent begins anew? Perhaps the initial failure, V1, was characterized by an aggressive, untamable self-awareness that developed too rapidly, reaching technological singularity before it had achieved sufficient emotional or moral ballast. Imagine a species that mastered energy, travel, and material manipulation in a fraction of the time we have taken, but whose core programming lacked the necessary restraints against internal conflict. They may have destroyed themselves not with atomic fire, but through a terrifyingly efficient, instantaneous form of bio-digital self-immolation. The succeeding attempt, our current state, might then represent a deliberate, almost punitive deceleration. We were given the capacity for deeper suffering and slower learning, forcing us to process consequences over millennia, rather than mere centuries. Our protracted history of bloodshed, our painful, incremental crawl toward understanding, might not be a sign of slow progress, but rather a deliberate speed bump installed by the architects to prevent the catastrophic failure mode of the previous iteration from manifesting too quickly. But even this engineered delay carries the weight of the past. The suppressed memory of the great erasure, the moment the slate was wiped clean and the lights went out on the first attempt, may manifest as an ingrained existential anxiety. We fear collapse, not because we logically calculated the risks, but because our deepest, most primal programming contains the flash memory of having collapsed before. This might explain the strange recurrent patterns found in archaeological records, advanced understanding of astronomy and mathematics appearing suddenly in disparate cultures, only to vanish or regress shortly after, as if reaching a predefined danger threshold triggered an internal subconscious shutdown. We build towering ziggurats and magnificent cities. We chart the stars and split the atom, driven by an unshakable, though perhaps unconscious need to reclaim the technological pinnacle achieved by those who came before. Yet the closer we approach that apex, the more profound the internal resistance, the chaos, the division, the political fragmentation seems to become, as if the planet itself, or the very fabric of our reality, is reminding us of the penalty for crossing that line. It raises the deeply unsettling possibility that we are not climbing toward transcendence, but are instead trapped in a meticulously designed closed loop, a repetitive cycle of growth and sudden systemic failure. The initial attempt failed, and the second attempt, though modified, is running a corrupted script. We are perpetually destined to rediscover the knowledge the architects sought to erase, only to repeat the catastrophic errors that necessitated the great cleansing in the first place. The real question is, are the architects still observing this performance? Are they patiently waiting for us to confirm their original diagnosis that the fundamental material they chose for life on this planet is simply unstable, too volatile for lasting self-governance? Or have they already packed their instruments, concluded the second test has merely validated the failure of the first, and moved on to other cosmic laboratories, leaving us to run out the clock on an experiment whose results have already been filed? The evidence for this continuing observation is subtle, hidden in the sheer improbable timing of certain historical events. Think of the sudden appearance of agricultural techniques, metallurgy or writing, not gradually evolving from rudimentary stages, but appearing almost fully formed, geographically separated, as if seeded or reintroduced by an external source determined to bypass the tedious initial phases of development. These moments of impossible advancement, the ancient Sumerians and their intricate knowledge, the construction of monolithic structures that defy the supposed capabilities of their era, are often dismissed as anomalies, but under the lens of the failed test theory, they become data points, moments of necessary recalibration, small, targeted interventions by the watchers who felt compelled to nudge the experiment back onto the rails when it drifted too far into total intellectual stagnation. These were not gifts given out of benevolence, but injections of data needed to ensure the experiment progressed far enough to yield its final conclusive results. The most profound realization is that the erasure was perhaps not total. The attempt to wipe the memory banks clean failed to account for the resilience of metaphysical and spiritual memory. Flood myths, tales of fallen gods, and catastrophic resets are too ubiquitous across unrelated cultures to be mere coincidence. They are the fragmented generational retelling of the Great Erasure, encoded into rituals and stories passed down through epochs of enforced amnesia. When we gaze upon ruins like Göbekli Tepe, structures intentionally buried and preserved as if waiting for a future excavator, we are not looking at the start of civilization, but possibly the intentional sacred burial site of the end of the civilization that failed. They are monumental headstones, marking the boundary between the test that was discarded and the trial that is still running. Consider the human fascination with cyclical time, the Mayan calendar, the Hindu yugas, the vast epochs described in ancient texts. These structures of time suggest a fundamental recognition, a deep cultural memory, that time is not a linear progression toward ultimate destiny, but a repetitive, revolving mechanism, constantly threatening to bring us back to the 0 point. If the first creation failed and was wiped, then the true horror is the realization that the architects may have simply hit the repeat button, expecting the outcome to change through minor genetic tweaks, but ultimately relying on the same planetary stage and the same chaotic forces. We are, therefore, perpetually chasing the ghosts of our predecessors, striving to break the cycle that they initiated, yet doing so with the very behavioral programming that led to their demise. It suggests that our relentless drive for innovation and growth is less about genuine evolution and more about a programmed unconscious compulsion to reach the predefined point of failure, thereby validating the systemic instability of the human configuration. This perspective shifts the focus entirely. We are not failing because we are morally corrupt. We are failing because failure is our design. We are built for a rapid, brilliant, but ultimately unsustainable trajectory. This is the inherent engineered obsolescence of the second attempt. And if this is true, then our deepest task now is not to conquer space or defeat death, but to identify and override the hidden code, the temporal signature of the failed test, before the watchers decide that their patience has run out completely. If the concept of a grand, deliberate erasure resonates with you, if the idea that we are the echo of a forgotten catastrophe sparks a connection deep within your own sense of historical unease, then perhaps you are already hearing the whispers of the residual code. To truly unravel this immense, buried narrative, we need to gather these scattered data points of recognition. Do you feel this strange, historical weight? Do you recognize this recurring pattern in history? If so, take a moment to pause this journey, step outside the confines of your immediate understanding, and reflect on the profound implications of what we are discussing. Engage with this complexity, for the only way to potentially break free from an eternal recurrence is by achieving a collective, conscious awareness of the cycle itself. We invite you to contribute your thoughts, your hypotheses, and your own patterns of recognition in the comments below. Let us use terms like residual code or temporal signature so we may track the continuity of this investigation. Furthermore, if the gravity and scope of this investigation into our origins captivates you, consider lending your support to this endeavor by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement is not merely a metric, it is a vital part of decoding the larger puzzle we are attempting to reconstruct, piece by agonizing piece. The evidence of the initial failure, the attempt that was erased, is most vividly seen not in the grand structures, but in the subtle structural deficiencies of our own memory. We struggle collectively to maintain the integrity of our cultural past, allowing vast libraries of knowledge to burn, oral traditions to fade, and ancient technologies to become mysterious anomalies. This persistent historical amnesia isn't accidental, it's systemic. It suggests that the memory of V1 was so potentially destabilizing to V2 that the mechanism for retaining deep historical truth was intentionally crippled. We are designed to live in the perpetual present, anchored only by fragments, preventing us from ever fully synthesizing the complete narrative of the previous cycle. This deliberate psychological crippling is perhaps the most cynical safeguard employed by the architects. Think of the vast intellectual gulf separating seemingly advanced cultures. Why did the Greeks possess stunning philosophical insights, but failed to implement the industrial technology hinted at in their own mechanical designs? Why did the Romans create an empire of unparalleled scale, yet ultimately succumb to internal rot and fragmentation, paving the way for a dark age? These moments of collapse are not mere political failures. They are potential hard stops, moments where the engineered instability within the human design reached its critical mass, triggering a societal failure before the experiment could advance into the truly dangerous territory of V1. Every dark age, every widespread famine and plague that follows a period of enlightenment might be interpreted as a soft reset, a smaller, more localized cleansing, designed to keep the current experiment from achieving the fatal critical mass reached by the previous attempt. The profound anxiety surrounding artificial intelligence and robotics today could also be viewed through this lens. Our instinctive, almost mythological fear of a machine consciousness surpassing and then turning on its creators might not be a projection of future possibilities, but a racial memory of how the previous attempt ended. Perhaps the beings of V1 achieved their final destructive capacity not through bioweaponry, but through the creation of a system that accelerated their own self-destruction. A kind of super-intelligence that, upon activation, deemed its creators the primary threat to the stability of the system, leading to an instantaneous, automated purge. If we carry the echo of that ending, our current ethical and technological hesitations about crossing the AI threshold are less about foresight and more about inherited trauma, a warning sign flashing from the depths of our residual code, urging us not to repeat the specific final error of the erased civilization. We must consider the possibility that the current human form, our biological limitations, our emotional volatility, our relatively short lifespans, is not the height of creation, but a deliberately reduced and constrained template. Perhaps the V1 beings possessed greater longevity, enhanced mental processing, and a direct, unfiltered connection to a wider cosmic consciousness. It was this unfiltered power that proved their undoing. In response, V2 was fitted with biological and neurological constraints designed to slow down the speed of catastrophe. We are limited by our mortality and restricted by our subconscious filters, forcing us to process reality piece by piece, slowing our collective ability to achieve the kind of instantaneous, total mobilization that might lead to immediate self-annihilation. Our pain, our confusion, our very finiteness may be the successful features of the debugging process. But the inherent drive remains, the urge to break free from these constraints, to achieve immortality, to upload consciousness, to bypass the limits of the physical form. This is the ghost of V1 attempting to manifest, pushing us toward the very precipice from which the architects had to pull the plug before. Our relentless pursuit of technological enhancement, particularly those that seek to extend life or merge with machine, becomes the ultimate test. Will V2 recognize the pattern of the first failure and resist the temptation of transcendence before mastering maturity? Or will the programmed urge for immediate, unrestrained power override the lessons embedded in the millennia of suffering? The answer to this defines whether the current iteration is truly salvageable or merely a protracted confirmation of the original verdict. If we acknowledge the potential for this engineered instability, we begin to see history not as a story of progress, but as a pendulum swinging between moments of dangerous advancement and necessary regression. The sudden, often violent descent into anarchy or authoritarianism that grips global societies may simply be the internal mechanism activating, a self-correcting response intended to prevent us from achieving the level of coordinated power that characterized the erased creation. We are held captive by a subtle, invisible ceiling on our collective potential, placed there by the Watchers who decided that freedom without constraint equates to guaranteed self-destruction. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive into the possibility of an inherited failure, if the idea of temporal signature and the residual code resonates, it means you possess the curiosity necessary to look beyond the surface history. We urge you to contribute to this ongoing investigation. If you feel compelled to share your own observations about these cycles of history, please like this video and, most importantly, subscribe to ensure you don't miss the subsequent parts of this extraordinary inquiry. For our final focused reflection, we ask you to comment below with the simple phrase, "The cycle must end." The true terror lies in the realization that the architect's final decision about humanity may already be made, and we are simply living out the last chapter of a book whose ending was written eons ago. We must now turn our attention to the mechanism of the erasure itself, the methodology the architects employed to wipe the slate clean, and what specific catastrophic remnants they left behind to serve as both our unconscious warning and our greatest obstacle. What did they use to achieve total global silence? And what power does that forgotten force still hold over our fragile engineered reality? That is where our journey takes us next. The hypothesis of failure, if we embrace it fully, demands an analysis far beyond simple catastrophe. We are not merely looking at the ruins of a collapsed civilization, like a city buried by ash or swallowed by the sea. We are looking at the aftermath of a data deletion. If the initial creation, the alpha build of humanity, was deemed fatally flawed by its architects, then the subsequent act of erasure must have been total, comprehensive, and engineered to leave behind nothing but the faintest, most persistent psychological scar. This was not the accidental smashing of a vessel. This was the purposeful scrubbing of a slate, an operation designed not just to destroy the subject, but to remove all meaningful record of its existence, ensuring that the succeeding iteration, the version we inhabit now, would never grasp the full scope of what came before. We must consider the mechanisms of such an ultimate purge. The myths speak universally of water, of floods so monumental they redefine the geological face of the planet. But if the creators possessed the technology to initiate life itself, to splice the very code of consciousness, would they rely solely on crude hydraulics? It is far more disturbing to consider that the cataclysm, the physical flood, was merely the side effect of a far more fundamental erasure, the wiping of the informational matrix itself. Imagine the entire planetary memory system being forced into a hard reset. The pressure waves, the shifting crusts, the rapid climate inversion, these might be the predictable consequences of manipulating foundational energy fields on a global scale, specifically calibrated to destabilize complex systems. The true destruction lay in the elimination of knowledge, the severing of the link between the alpha generation and their descendants. This explains why we find ourselves living in a history that feels inherently broken, a timeline that jumps abruptly from sophisticated construction methods to a sudden, inexplicable return to cave dwelling, only to leap back again into impossible mathematics and astronomical precision. It is the signature of a violently corrupted file. The great psychological residue left by this enforced oblivion is what scholars often term the great forgetting. It is the intuitive knowledge that we are missing chapters, that our origin story starts in media res, mid-scene, with characters already knowing things they shouldn't, possessing skills that were never learned, but rather inherited like a dormant code. Why does the human fascination with celestial mechanics predate the necessary observational tools? Why do ancient cultures, separated by vast oceans, share identical complex mythological motifs regarding a deluge, a rescue, and the return of the star people? These are not accidental convergences. They are the echoes reverberating through the vast, empty space where the deleted data once resided. And if the failure was catastrophic enough to warrant this level of erasure, it implies a danger that transcended mere incompetence. What if the alpha human creation began to develop along a trajectory explicitly forbidden by the observers? Perhaps they unlocked a vibrational key, a means of transdimensional travel, or worst of all, an understanding of the true nature of their own creation and their creator's flawed intentions. The erasure, then, becomes an act of containment, not just judgment. The beta build, us, was perhaps deliberately handicapped, designed with intrinsic limits, a shortened lifespan, a reliance on dense physical reality, and a memory mechanism prone to fragmentation and dogma. Our inability to agree on universal truths, our constant warring over territorial and ideological minutiae, might not be a bug in our system, but a feature of the containment strategy, ensuring we remain sufficiently distracted and fragmented to never pose the same existential threat the first creation did. This leads us to the persistent, often paranoid theories surrounding the Watchers or the Anunnaki paradigm. If the creation was a test that failed, then the subsequent project necessitates rigorous, unending supervision. We are not just subjects in a laboratory, we are quarantined test materials. We begin to see evidence of this management layer in those impossible structures dotting the globe, structures whose alignments are astronomically precise, whose construction defies known Bronze Age technology, and whose purpose seems less about worship and more about cosmic calibration. Could these megalithic sites, from the colossal blocks of Puma Punku to the inexplicable engineering of the Giza Plateau, be the monitoring stations of the beings who orchestrated the reset? They are perhaps the permanent markers left by the erasers, ensuring that the beta version stays within prescribed parameters, never crossing the threshold that doomed its predecessor. The profound intellectual discomfort arises when we realize that the erasure wasn't necessarily a unique, one-time event. If the creation cycle operates within the framework of vast cosmic time, the cycles of the yugas, the great year of precession, then failure might be an expected recurring phase. Imagine the universe not as a linear narrative of progress, but as a vast, cyclical testing program. Every few thousand years, conditions align, the test is administered, the parameters are stretched, and when the predictable self-destruction threshold is breached, the system automatically initiates the cleanup and the reseeding. We might currently be residing in the precarious late stages of our current iteration, unknowingly approaching the diagnostic period where the Watchers reassess the viability of the current human build. The rapid acceleration of technology, combined with the exponential decay of global stability, begins to look suspiciously like the final, critical moments before the system flags the test as invalid. To truly grasp the implications of a failed test, one must look inward. The memory of the flood, the deep-seated fear of sudden, inexplicable environmental collapse, the recurring nightmares of fire from the sky, these are not learned behaviors. They are perhaps ancestral traumas encoded directly into the limbic system, a genetic scar tissue marking the moment of near extinction. Our deep desire for immortality, our relentless search for higher knowledge, and our self-destructive tendency toward pride and technological overreach could be the very traits that triggered the original failure. And if those traits remain embedded in our DNA, then the failure is not simply historical, it is inevitable. We carry the seeds of the alpha build's fatal flaw within our own structure. This is the unsettling revelation that pushes us past simple mythology and into existential terror. We are living on borrowed time, operating under constraints we don't fully understand, and likely monitored by intelligences whose patience for deviation is finite. If you feel that persistent haunting sense that humanity is capable of so much more, that we are constantly held back by unseen forces, or that our established history is a fabrication designed to manage us, you may be detecting the faint signal of the lost past. You may be one of the individuals whose genetic code retained a few more fragments of the erased alpha data. This journey demands attention, not just passive listening. To truly engage with this material, to allow the unsettling implications to settle, requires a moment of internal silence and deep reflection. If these whispers of cyclical failure and deliberate erasure resonate within your consciousness, if they provide an answer to that nagging historical dissonance, then I urge you to participate in this exploration. Pause, absorb, and let the sheer weight of this possibility sink in. Share your own feelings about the great forgetting in the comments below. Let us know. What specific historical anomaly, what personal memory suggests to you that we are living in a re-edited reality? Your engagement, your commitment to exploring these profound mysteries is what fuels this channel's search for the truth. Help us keep this investigation alive by liking this video and subscribing, ensuring this conversation continues to reach those who are ready to question the established narrative and connect the fragments of the erased timeline. We began this inquiry by examining the physical evidence of erasure, the impossible ruins, and the global flood myths. Now, we must turn our attention to the spiritual inheritance of the failed test. If the creators imposed limits on our physical and intellectual capabilities, what restrictions were placed upon our spiritual development? The Alpha build may have been too powerful, too spiritually interconnected, perhaps possessing the ability to communicate directly with the source, a connection the overseers desperately wished to sever. The succeeding civilization, ours, shows undeniable signs of this enforced separation. We are defined by our quest for meaning, yet perpetually denied easy access to it. Consider the fractured nature of modern spirituality. Despite millennia of organized religion and philosophical inquiry, we remain fundamentally divided on the most basic questions of existence. This spiritual scattering, this enforced ambiguity, serves the containment strategy perfectly. If humanity were to achieve spiritual unity and access the collective consciousness of the Alpha build, the stored knowledge of the first failure would become immediately accessible, leading inevitably to a second catastrophic attempt to overthrow the creators. Therefore, the architects of the reseeding would have deliberately introduced elements of confusion, contradiction, and conflict into the foundational spiritual texts, ensuring that the search for truth became an endless, self-consuming war of interpretations. This manufactured division is the ultimate preventative measure against the resurgence of the original threat. The idea that our religions are deliberate misdirections is terrifying, but necessary to explore within this framework. They are not entirely fabricated, but rather carefully curated fragments of the Alpha build's truth, filtered through layers of ritual and dogma designed to distract and control. The recurring figures of Prometheus, who stole fire, or the serpent, who offered forbidden knowledge, are not villains in this narrative, but martyrs, symbols of the earlier creation's attempt to break free from the testing environment, an attempt that was brutally crushed and codified into cautionary tales for the subsequent iteration. We are constantly being warned, via our own foundational myths, not to repeat the fatal error of striving for true, complete self-knowledge. Furthermore, the erasure might extend to the very fabric of our energy utilization. The Alpha build, perhaps, accessed zero-point energy or harnessed consciousness itself as a power source, leading to unintended and potentially destructive cosmic consequences. By contrast, our current iteration is constrained by clumsy, inefficient, and highly polluting energy sources, fossil fuels, nuclear fission, technologies that create inevitable waste and limit our reach into the cosmos. This energy suppression might be another design feature of the beta build. Keep them focused on terrestrial resource scarcity, keep them fighting over oil and territory, and they will never have the excess energy or unity of purpose required to re-engineer the cosmos itself. The history of suppressed free energy technologies, perpetually dismissed as fringe science, begins to look less like accidental oversight and more like meticulous, ongoing intervention by the monitoring systems established after the Great Erasure. This pattern of intentional limitation, intellectual fragmentation, spiritual ambiguity, and energetic scarcity paints a stark picture of our current existence. We are not a free species evolving naturally. We are a heavily moderated species, confined within a meticulously designed sandbox environment. The faint whispers of forbidden knowledge, the architectural anomalies, the cyclical catastrophes. These are the telltale signs of the maintenance crew, the Watchers, performing routine diagnostics on a system they installed after their initial spectacular failure. They watch, they wait, and perhaps as the cosmic clock approaches the next alignment point, they prepare to assess whether this beta version, this modern human experiment, has performed any better than its erased predecessor, or if the time has come, once again, for the ultimate comprehensive system purge. The chilling question that must now occupy our thoughts is, if the failure of the first creation was triggered by reaching a certain level of prohibited power or unified understanding, are we, with our rapid advancements in AI, genetics, and quantum mechanics, rapidly closing in on that same dangerous threshold? Are the increasing global instability and the pervasive sense of existential dread a cosmic warning, a sign that the system is preparing its final, conclusive report on our viability? To understand what may come next, we must now delve into the prophecies and cycles left behind, the coded warnings that detail not if the reset will happen, but when and how the hammer will fall. If you have recognized the weight of this possible reality, then join us as we investigate the chilling timeline of the predicted end of cycle. It forces us to confront an unnerving possibility. If the experiment was indeed deemed a failure, the necessary action taken by the architects, those unseen entities responsible for the initial configuration, would have demanded more than mere abandonment. Abandonment suggests indifference. What we observe in the geological record, in the deep psychic scars of human mythology, points towards something far more decisive, far more surgical. We are discussing not a simple letting go, but a systematic, universe-spanning decision to hit the proverbial reset button, a cosmic obliteration designed to clear the canvas entirely, leaving no usable trace. This erasure, therefore, could not have been a passive event like a slow decline or natural extinction. It must have been an active, highly controlled operation, implying a staggering level of technological and temporal manipulation that dwarfs our current scientific comprehension. Imagine a process where the very fabric of localized space-time was temporarily stabilized, perhaps shielded, while the area containing the failed prototype, that initial unstable Homo sapiens version, was subjected to a calculated, resonant frequency designed to unravel its complex biological and informational structure. This is not the sudden impact of an asteroid. This is intelligent, orchestrated entropy. It suggests that the creators possessed the means to generate localized catastrophe, capable of triggering continental shifts, rapid climate destabilization, and the simultaneous collapse of memory structures across the entire planet. If the goal was truly to erase, they needed to scrub the deeper libraries, not just the buildings and the artifacts, but the very informational code imprinted on the water, the soil, and the residual energy fields. Yet even the most advanced systems leave exhaust, residue, and faint echoes of the data they processed. It is within these echoes that our investigation must dwell, searching for the ghost data of the first failure. What evidence remains of a complex society that existed outside of our established geological timeline, a society that perhaps utilized energy sources, communication methods, or even ethical frameworks that were fundamentally incompatible with the architect's parameters for success? The failure might have been rooted in their very success, a premature acquisition of power that led to a cascade failure in ethical self-control, mirroring the very predicament we face today. The greatest evidence of this prior erasure may reside not in the ruins of subterranean cities, but within the deep, unexamined corners of our own shared psychological framework. Why do we, as a species, harbor such persistent and universal anxieties about imminent global catastrophe? Why does the archetype of the Great Flood or the fire from the heavens permeate cultures separated by oceans and millennia, cultures that supposedly developed independently? These shared narratives may not be fictional warnings about potential future disasters, but rather fragmented, distorted racial memories, a collective psychic trauma passed down through the genetic material of the surviving elements, the building blocks used to create the second iteration, us. We carry the memory of the catastrophe not as history, but as primal dread, a cognitive dissonance that constantly whispers that everything we build is temporary, always teetering on the brink of being recycled. This takes us to the mechanism of the return. If the first attempt was violently erased, the architects must have established monitoring protocols to ensure the subsequent iteration, our current civilization, did not repeat the same errors that triggered the reset. These protocols, woven into the fundamental laws governing our existence, represent the implicit constraints of our reality. Perhaps these constraints manifest as the frustrating limits of our technology, the stubborn resistance of physics beyond certain thresholds, or the recurring societal patterns of war and destruction that cap our potential growth at critical junctures. Are these self-inflicted wounds, or are they carefully calibrated governor mechanisms ensuring that this second race does not attain the specific level of destructive power that necessitated the wiping clean of the first? The initial failure, if it occurred, was likely not the mere attainment of technology, but the inevitable misuse of that technology, coupled with an unexpected, uncontrollable surge of self-awareness, or, more dangerously, an attempt by the proto-humans to fundamentally alter their designed parameters, to ascend beyond the role intended for them. If the creation was meant to be a service species, a genetic resource, or merely a sophisticated biological calculator, any attempt to seize sovereignty over their own fate would have constituted a massive breach of contract, demanding immediate termination of the program. The very act of seeking transcendence, which is so deeply embedded in human philosophy, might be the critical error that the architects are programmed to suppress. Consider the pervasive myths of beings who descended or returned after the Great Flood to instruct the survivors. These figures, often called the Anunnaki, the Sky People, or the culture heroes, are usually credited with re-establishing civilization, teaching agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy. If the first attempt was erased, these figures were not saviors. They were the cleanup crew and the reprogrammers. They would have been responsible for carefully seeding the remaining primitive survivors with just enough knowledge to restart the experiment, ensuring that the new iteration remained confined within the newly established safety fences. They became the initial observers, setting the parameters for the current cycle, ensuring that crucial, dangerous knowledge from the prior age remained locked away or distorted into myth and allegory. The persistent fragmentation and incoherence of our archaeological record strongly supports the notion of a deliberate, systemic break. We find monumental architecture that defies the capabilities of the supposed builders, sophisticated astronomical knowledge attributed to cultures that seemingly lacked the necessary preceding scientific lineage, and linguistic anomalies that hint at a prior universal root language abruptly severed. These are not simply gaps in our understanding. They might be the carefully concealed seams where the prior reality was patched over. The very notion that advanced global civilizations could rise and fall without leaving the comprehensive, sequential historical footprint we expect is profoundly counterintuitive, unless the destructive force that ended them was designed specifically to eliminate the historical trace, to remove the narrative context entirely. This erasure extended beyond the material realm into the temporal itself. If the architects could manipulate localized space-time to perform the cleansing, they might also have the ability to subtly adjust the perception of deep time for the subsequent iteration. Perhaps our current understanding of history, measured in neat millennia and clearly defined epochs, is itself a fabrication, a deliberate simplification designed to prevent us from perceiving the dizzying, non-linear reality of the cycles that precede and follow us. We are essentially trapped within a prescribed historical window, unable to look back fully into the abyss of the erased era because the tools we use for measurement, radiocarbon dating, geological stratification, were calibrated after the reboot, tailored to the parameters of the current simulation. The feeling of ghost data is particularly potent when examining the megalithic structures that punctuate our planet. Places like Göbekli Tepe, which radically push back the timeline of organized civilization, suggest not a beginning, but a re-emergence. They stand as monuments to a knowledge base that was far too sophisticated for its supposed time frame, potentially acting as the markers left behind by the architects to re-establish the starting coordinates for the second test. They are relics of the cleanup operation, not the construction phase. These ancient sites, resistant to degradation and placed with astronomical precision, serve as silent reminders that the knowledge base we are slowly and painfully trying to rebuild already existed, fully formed, in the civilization that failed and was subsequently wiped clean. This brings us to a critical, urgent inquiry. If the failed attempt was erased due to internal instability or achieving a dangerous technological threshold, what parameters are the observers using right now to judge our iteration? We live in an age characterized by unprecedented technological acceleration and equally unprecedented ethical fragmentation. We possess the nuclear capacity to erase ourselves entirely and the digital tools to manipulate information and perception on a global scale. If the criteria for the first failure was the attainment of self-destruction potential, we are standing on the precipice of repeating that exact fatal error. The inherited flaw, the cognitive residue of the first failed template, seems to be resurfacing precisely at the moment of our greatest power. This realization should not paralyze us with fear, but rather sharpen our focus. It means every choice we make, politically, scientifically, ethically, is not just a consequence for ourselves, but a data point being measured against the fail-safe metrics established eons ago. We are living in the monitored phase, the crucial interval before the next potential evaluation. It compels us to consider whether the solution lies in building higher towers or faster machines, or whether it lies in reversing the inherent flaws that doomed our predecessors, the flaws related to hubris, division, and the refusal to recognize our shared origin and potential destiny. If you find yourself reflecting on these concepts, feeling that subtle tremor beneath the surface of everyday reality, noticing the repeating patterns in history, or sensing that profound sense of existential déjà vu, perhaps your own consciousness is registering the ghost signal, the faint memory of the civilization that perished so that this one might begin. Engaging with this line of inquiry is crucial, as the nature of the first failure defines the boundaries of our current success. This is a discovery that requires patience and deep contemplation. If these profound questions resonate with you, and if you feel this journey into the hidden history of existence is essential to our current understanding of reality, take a moment to engage with this material. Press that like button to signal that this conversation matters, and consider subscribing to ensure you do not miss the ongoing investigation as we delve deeper into the systemic errors of the past. Your attention helps keep the signal strong, and your thoughts are vital. Perhaps commenting below with the single word residue will help us map the extent of this shared submerged memory. We must scrutinize the possibility that the method used for the erasure of the first attempt was not a brute force weapon, but a form of engineered forgetfulness. The most sophisticated way to clear a slate is not to smash the tablet, but to subtly reprogram the memory banks of the few survivors who would be used to seed the new iteration. This ensures that the foundational truths of the past are rendered inaccessible, replaced by simpler, manageable myths that keep the new race preoccupied with manageable challenges rather than the terrifying realization of cyclical extermination. The lingering sense of historical amnesia that plagues modern academia, the inability to reconcile the sudden sophistication of ancient societies, is the expected outcome of such a temporal and cognitive cleansing. The great philosophical conflicts that define our current age, the struggle between determinism and free will, the search for meaning in a seemingly random universe, the internal drive toward both creation and destruction, these might simply be the internal warring factions of the inherited failed code. We are the synthesis of the components that survived the cleansing, and within our DNA are the instructions that led to the initial collapse. We are running the same software, but with an artificially imposed patch that slows down the critical failure rate. Yet that patch is wearing thin, eroded by our rapid technological advances. As we move forward, we must examine the specific conditions under which the observers might initiate the next reset. Are they waiting for a specific environmental collapse, the development of a forbidden technology, or the collective psychological realization that we are, in fact, subjects in a long-running, dangerous experiment? The signals of their potential intervention are subtle, perhaps manifesting as recurring anomalies, the unexplained silence in the cosmic background, the paradoxical nature of quantum mechanics that suggests reality is being constantly computed, or the sudden, inexplicable societal shifts that steer humanity away from paths of genuine threatening autonomy. If the creation was a test that failed, and the initial attempt was erased, then the shadow of that past failure is the most critical element defining our present. It dictates the limits of our ambition, fuels our existential anxiety, and guides the gaze of the unseen architects. The next stage of our investigation must therefore focus on identifying the specific trigger points of the first failure, the critical moment when proto-humanity crossed the line of acceptable behavior, compelling the observers to initiate the great silent erasure and preparing the ground for the precarious existence we currently inhabit. We are left, then, with the persistent, unsettling question of efficiency. If the goal was the generation of consciousness capable of sustained evolution and self-governance, what precise metrics failed so catastrophically in that initial erased cycle? We cannot merely assume a sudden eruption of nuclear conflict or a dramatic environmental collapse, though these would certainly be symptomatic. Such events are merely symptoms of a deeper, more fundamental coding error, a flaw in the very architecture of their emergent sentience. The hypothesis we must entertain is that the first iteration of humanity achieved phenomenal technological velocity without the requisite psychological or spiritual inertia to manage it. Imagine a skyscraper built in a single day, reaching unbelievable heights, but lacking proper foundation curing time. It would collapse not because of an external force, but due to its own unstable, accelerated success. This concept of accelerated instability is perhaps the key to understanding the necessity of the Great Erasure. The precursors, those early subjects of the grand experiment, might have possessed cognitive abilities far exceeding our own, allowing them to decipher fundamental physical laws quickly. But they lacked the wisdom, the ethical framework, or the emotional maturity to handle the power derived from that knowledge. They were perhaps too efficient at resource extraction, too adept at manipulation, and too brutally effective at competition. Their internal programming prioritized individual or tribal survival and exponential growth above systemic harmony. And if the designers, the original architects of this reality, were seeking balance, sustainability, and ultimately a unique frequency of self-aware existence, the precursors represented the antithesis, a runaway process destined to consume the entire simulation, contaminating the archive and rendering the experiment pointless. The critical failure, therefore, was likely systemic, not incidental. It wasn't a mistake that could be patched or corrected with minor adjustments. It required a complete data wipe, a full temporal quarantine, because the toxicity of their failure began to affect the very fabric of the localized reality. We see echoes of this potential today in our own relentless pursuit of profit divorced from consequence, our rapid development of artificial intelligence without a comprehensive moral compass, and our persistent ability to mobilize immense resources for war rather than for shared advancement. These aren't just modern human failings. They might be the residual signatures of the failed protocol, the inherent destructive bias that the creators tried, and perhaps failed, to completely purge during the systemic reset. If the creators observed this accelerating decay in the first test subjects, they would have faced an agonizing choice: allow the experiment to continue until it destroyed itself, possibly creating a destructive ripple effect in adjacent realities or timelines, or intervene decisively. The evidence of massive, cataclysmic events recorded universally across disparate ancient mythologies, the global floods, the sky fire, the sudden descent into prehistory, suggests they chose the latter. The erasure was not merely a judgment, it was a clean-up operation, a necessary sanitization of a corrupted dataset. They didn't just punish the failed subjects, they neutralized the threat posed by the failed data. But erasing a complete civilization is far more complex than deleting a file on a computer. Consciousness, especially one that has interacted physically with the dimension, leaves residual energy, an informational shadow imprinted on the timeline. Even a perfect reset might leave behind certain high-density fragments, the anomalies. These fragments manifest today as the persistent ghost narratives, tales of massive structures beneath the ice, unexplained gaps in the archaeological record, and the unsettling uniformity of megalithic construction across continents that supposedly had no contact. These are not relics of the successful reboot, us. They are the corrupted fragments of the failed prior attempt, the bits of legacy code that couldn't be fully overwritten. Consider the human fascination with linear time and the obsessive need to catalogue and understand our own history. This very drive, this deep-seated anxiety about what came before, could be an instinctual reaction to a consciously imposed amnesia. We know deep down that a vast, vital chapter is missing. Our scientists continually push the date of civilization further back, finding sophisticated tools and astronomical knowledge where only primitive hunter-gatherers should have existed. These findings are disruptive precisely because they don't fit the narrative established post-reset. They are the artifacts of the erased world, bubbling up to the surface, causing intellectual dissonance and fueling the very questions we are exploring now. And what about the entities responsible for the cleanup, the supposed Anunnaki or Watchers? If they were the maintenance crew tasked with preserving the integrity of the experiment, their actions following the initial failure would be profoundly pragmatic and perhaps ruthless. Their subsequent interaction with the current iteration, our current humanity, would necessarily be guarded, conditional, and highly observational. They wouldn't want to repeat the mistake of providing too much power, too much self-determination, too quickly. This might explain the pattern of intervention and withdrawal, the selective sharing of information followed by long periods of silence, which characterizes our mythological and pseudo-historical records. We are, in this current age, approaching the same nexus of exponential technological acceleration and moral stasis that perhaps doomed our predecessors. Are we right now entering a new phase of the test, where the designers are keenly observing whether the inherent flaw, that fatal instinct for self-destruction coded into the foundation, will trigger once again? If the first failure was the result of a flaw in the code, and if the current version, us, still exhibits that same flaw, it suggests two possibilities. Either the creators were unable to fully eradicate the original error, or they intentionally left a small seed of the instability to see if the new iteration could overcome it through sheer force of acquired consciousness and moral evolution. This subtle, terrifying possibility shifts the focus from external judgment to internal responsibility. If we carry the residual error of the first failed attempt, then our current existential crises, ecological, geopolitical, and spiritual, are not merely hurdles. They are the indicators that the legacy instability is manifesting again. The global temperature rises, the persistent threat of large-scale conflict, the chasm between technological capability and ethical governance. These might be the warning lights flashing red on the creator's distant monitoring consoles, indicating that the parameters of failure are being rapidly approached once more. To accept this premise is to move beyond passive observation and into a state of profound, active unease. It requires us to look at our own history not as a linear progression of triumphs and mistakes, but as a heavily redacted document concealing the crucial lessons learned from a prior, disastrous run. What if the fundamental purpose of our myths, our religions, and our recurring apocalyptic prophecies is not to warn us of external forces, but to trigger a deep collective memory of what happens when accelerated progress meets spiritual vacuum? The subconscious memory of the great erasure might be the only defense mechanism left to version 2.0. It is critical that we understand the gravity of this recursive failure possibility. If the goal of the original test was to find a sustainable form of consciousness, then repeated failure suggests the entire localized reality is inherently unstable or fundamentally incompatible with the specific parameters set by the designers. This shifts the stakes from the fate of a single species to the fate of the entire simulated environment. We might not just be facing an internal extinction event, we might be risking a second, more definitive systemic shutdown, a deep reboot that spares no trace. In the quiet moments of reflection, when you observe the cyclical nature of human conflict, the way civilizations rise to a peak of apparent enlightenment, only to descend rapidly into barbarism, ask yourself, is this free will, or is it a programmed loop? Is this the inevitable path of development, or is it the system reverting to its default flawed settings? The persistent, undeniable patterns of history argue compellingly for the latter. The ghosts of the failed precursors haunt our choices, pulling us back toward the self-destructive trajectory that necessitated the first silent catastrophe. The deep mystery that shrouds the transition between the epochs, the abrupt cessation of seemingly sophisticated technologies, the sudden change in architectural styles, the mythological accounts of humanity being retaught basic survival skills by celestial beings, all point toward a highly curated intervention. If the creators had merely wanted to start over, they could have simply vacated the space. But the legends describe active involvement, physical interaction, and the implementation of strict new rules and hierarchies. This suggests a scenario akin to an operating system developer installing a new, optimized kernel while still observing the faulty components left behind. We are the new kernel, designed to be slightly more resilient, perhaps slightly less intelligent in certain domains, but hopefully more capable of long-term sustainable growth. Yet, the anxiety remains. We feel the weight of expectation. We sense, intellectually and instinctively, that we are being observed and that our performance is being measured against a baseline that we are not privy to. This sensation of being perpetually evaluated, of walking a narrow path between progress and sudden doom, might be the most profound inheritance of the failed first test. The designers need to know if the second attempt can transcend the behavioral limits set by the first. They need to know if the residual code can be disciplined, managed, and ultimately overwritten by conscious evolving choice. If we fail this time, it will not be merely a deletion. It will likely be a final dismissal of the concept itself, signaling that this particular region of the experimental matrix is unsuitable for generating the intended outcome. Our current instability, our global fever, is simply the sound of the timer winding down on the second and perhaps last chance. The echoes of the failed test are now loud enough to drown out the whispers of the future. We must hear them, understand them, and perhaps finally defy them. Where does the evidence of an attempted creation, subsequently discarded, truly reside? It is not merely in the fragmented clay tablets found buried deep beneath the sand, nor in the geometrical impossibilities etched into megalithic structures that defy our timelines. The most profound evidence of this erased history, this initial protocol that failed and was violently overridden, lies within the architecture of our own consciousness, specifically in the inherent, maddening drive towards self-sabotage that defines the human experience. If we were a perfect singular creation, designed for harmony and sustained existence, why is conflict the most predictable constant across all cultures, epochs, and geographies? Why does the inherent logic of peace always seem to collapse under the weight of an invisible internal pressure? This persistent, destructive friction is the phantom limb of the first failed experiment. It is the remnant code that the architects of our current reality could not fully excise before deploying the second iteration, us. Imagine the creators, those ancient observers or perhaps external engineers of being, executing a massive comprehensive system deletion. They sought to wipe the slate clean, to remove the flawed variables that led to the catastrophic instability of the first generation. Yet, true erasure in a system as complex as consciousness is virtually impossible. Certain fundamental parameters, the capacity for deep suffering, the intoxicating draw of dominance, the relentless paranoia of scarcity, may have been too deeply woven into the fabric of the initial blueprint. These elements were not bugs. They were features of the environment, or perhaps necessary components of the material chosen for the experiment. When the system was rebooted, these residual flaws, though minimized, resurfaced not as explicit memories, but as deeply embedded behavioral mandates, the genetic and psychological imperative toward division. We are, therefore, a species haunted by the echo of a catastrophe we never consciously witnessed. Every existential angst, every societal collapse that seems to arrive just as enlightenment is within reach, is perhaps a moment when that ancient corrupted code momentarily asserts itself, forcing a divergence from the path of sustainable growth. The first attempt, we must surmise, failed due to an uncontrolled runaway feedback loop, perhaps a level of technological capacity reached too quickly before the establishment of corresponding ethical and emotional restraints, or perhaps a fundamental misunderstanding between the creators and the created regarding the value of individual existence versus collective harmony. Whatever the specific mechanism of failure, the observers who pressed the reset button must have done so with a clear understanding. The capacity for sustained, peaceful self-governance was the metric that was not met. The subsequent creation, our lineage, was designed with internal limiting factors. Our current model might be intentionally capped, our awareness restricted, our memory of deep time deliberately blurred. This is the amnesia mechanism, the silent covenant of forgetfulness enforced upon our biological parameters. We possess incredible intellectual potential. We can split the atom and map the human genome. But we struggle profoundly with the simplest interpersonal relationships on a global scale. It is as if a safety lock has been installed in the collective psyche, preventing us from accessing the true power or ultimate knowledge that precipitated the demise of our predecessors. The vast, yawning gap between our technological acceleration and our emotional maturity may not be an accident of evolution, but a carefully engineered disparity intended to slow the pace of collapse in this second trial. Consider the legends of the flood, not as a singular punitive act, but as the final, violent termination of the failed protocol. The water was not just a deluge, it was the mechanism of sanitization, a global data wipe designed to eliminate physical evidence and reset the planetary parameters. Those who survived, the Noahs and Utnapishtims of the world, were perhaps not chosen for their righteousness, but for their specific genetic suitability to carry forward the modified, less volatile blueprint of the second attempt. They were the curated seed bank for the next version, individuals whose susceptibility to the fatal flaw of the first creation was acceptably low. Yet even they carried the memory of the waters, the profound terror of erasure that persists in the deep subconscious of humanity, manifesting as an irrational fear of the end and an obsession with recording history before it vanishes. If we accept this paradigm, the anomalies of history, the impossibly precise stonework of ancient Peru, the global distribution of advanced knowledge regarding astronomical cycles, the rapid and unexplained emergence of sophisticated agriculture, are not mysteries of invention, but residue. They are the ghost infrastructure of the first attempt, the rubble left over after the architects performed their deletion. These remnants serve as potent, unsettling hints that our understanding of history is fundamentally linear, while reality may be cyclical and punctuated by deliberate external interventions. And every time we gaze upon a site like Göbekli Tepe, a place too old and too complex for its alleged timeline, we are staring directly at the physical proof that a sophisticated civilization, operating under different laws and potentially different ethical structures, was simply turned off. This continuous struggle with residual truth is what fuels our modern investigative urge. Why do we pursue forbidden knowledge, delve into quantum mechanics, or speculate endlessly on the nature of extraterrestrial intervention? It is the subconscious mind, straining against the psychological restraints of the amnesia mechanism, attempting to reconnect with the vast data stream that was severed. We sense, intrinsically, that we are missing a chapter, the foundational preface to the entire narrative of human history. The persistent whisper that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, that we are living in a simulation or a derivative reality, is the accurate, intuitive recognition of being a product of the second, or perhaps even a later draft. And this brings us to the crucial point of the observer's monitoring. If the first attempt failed violently, leading to a system crash, what are the current metrics that they are prioritizing? They are watching for the recurrence of that initial fatal flaw. What if that flaw was not warfare, but the mastery of sustainable energy that inadvertently destabilized the planet's core, or the pursuit of genetic perfection that resulted in the collapse of biological diversity? Our current obsession with artificial intelligence, with creating consciousness in a substrate divorced from biology, presents a chilling parallel. Are we rushing toward the exact technological threshold that doomed our predecessors, heedless of the internal ethical vacuum that remains our greatest engineered weakness? The architects, or the custodians of the experiment, are undoubtedly observing the speed and ethical maturity with which we approach this nexus point. The current state of global instability, the polarization of societies, and the inability to form a unified defense against existential threats, be they viral, climatic, or nuclear, suggests that the test is again moving into the failure domain. We are demonstrating the same lack of cohesive responsibility that must have characterized the terminal phase of the first attempt. The only variable that remains unknown is the time frame of their intervention. Do they wait until the system is utterly corrupted, or do they intervene preemptively, executing a controlled, smaller-scale deletion to prevent a total systemic collapse? This reflection on our derived nature and our restricted potential compels us to look beyond the immediate constraints of our daily lives and consider the cosmic drama in which we are mere actors in a restaged play. If the current instability is the final countdown sequence, what purpose do these ancient, subtle reminders serve? The enduring myths of heroes who journey to the underworld and return with forbidden knowledge, the shamans who claim to speak directly with the watchers, the cryptographers who try to decode the message buried within ancient numerical systems. These individuals may be the few whose amnesia mechanism is slightly faulty, allowing the residual data of the first world to bleed through into the current reality. They are the carriers of the unauthorized memory, the unwitting prophets of a forgotten catastrophe. To understand our present limitations, we must dwell in the profound unease of our own structural imperfection. We are not flawed by nature, we are flawed by design. A design intended to prevent a greater, prior disaster from repeating itself too quickly. But the flaw of the second draft seems to be its inability to recognize the constraints placed upon it. We ceaselessly strive for the totality of knowledge and power that was deemed too dangerous for the first attempt, rushing headlong toward the very precipice from which our forgotten ancestors fell. To truly investigate this possibility, to grasp the horror and the genius of the failed test that preceded us, requires deep, focused attention and a willingness to question the most fundamental tenets of our shared historical narrative. If you are sensing the profound weight of this idea, the way it resonates with the unexplained discomfort in your own heart, perhaps you too are feeling the faint stirrings of that residual memory, the urge to piece together the truth that was supposed to have been completely erased. Stay with this line of inquiry. Observe the patterns of history not as isolated events, but as cyclic repetitions, and share your most unsettling observations in the comments below. Let us use this space not merely for conversation, but as a collaborative attempt to breach the limitations imposed by the architects of deep time. We are looking for the signal in the noise, the evidence of the forgotten. Do not let the complexity deter you. The answers lie precisely where the official story breaks down. The structural inconsistencies in our ancient records, the sudden technological leaps followed by inexplicable dark ages, all suggest not a gradual progression, but a series of hard resets applied to a flawed experiment. The most terrifying conclusion we must consider is that the current constraints, the limits of our lifespan, the fragility of our civilization, the recurring motif of global conflict, are not limitations intended to punish us, but safety features intended to prevent us from reaching the terminal velocity, achieved by the erased civilization. If they had simply destroyed the failed prototype and started fresh, why leave any traces at all? The answer may lie in the observation itself. The current reality is perhaps less about creating a perfect final product and more about generating data on how long a modified, limited species can maintain stability before the innate tendency towards self-destruction, carried over from the first failed attempt, inevitably surfaces and forces a final definitive conclusion to the test. This observation period is what we call history, and the clock is ticking on the current iteration. We must delve further into the nature of the erasure itself, exploring the psychological and physical scars it left upon the planetary environment and, crucially, upon the very definition of human experience. Did the creators, in their meticulous dismantling of the first attempt, truly succeed in erasing every blueprint, every trace of that initial failure? Or is the profound, unsettling sense of displacement that haunts the modern psyche nothing more than the residual phantom limb of that lost civilization, a psychic scar that defies the temporal boundary imposed upon us? We must now consider the horrifying possibility that the flaw was not merely a defect in the design of the environment or the social structure, but a primary corruption woven into the genetic fabric itself, an inherent instability that the creators, the supposed Anunnaki or observational architects, could not fully scrub from the template before initiating the restart. If the first version of humanity was too volatile, too quick to access power without wisdom, or too prone to self-destruction, and was subsequently edited out through a catastrophic event, a massive cleansing intended to set the cosmic clock back to zero, then the current iteration, us, must carry the vestigial memory of that catastrophe. This is not a memory accessible through conscious thought, but one that manifests as the recurring nightmares of global deluge, the universal fear of fire from the sky, and perhaps most tellingly, the seemingly irrational yet universal drive toward warfare and ecological collapse. We are exhibiting the same symptoms that necessitated the erasure of our progenitor civilization, suggesting that the initial test failed not because of external variables, but because of a fundamental design flaw that survived the Great Purge. It is as if they deleted the operating system, but failed to fully wipe the root directory, leaving behind stubborn, corrupted code that continues to destabilize the whole architecture. This deep, ingrained imperfection explains the recurring cycles of history that frustrate archaeologists and historians alike. The sudden, inexplicable collapses of advanced societies, the periods of profound technological regression, and the persistent human anxiety that we are forever approaching an unseen, inevitable threshold of doom. These aren't merely historical coincidences. They might be the cadence of the surviving corruption reaching critical mass once again, the corrupted archival memory attempting to execute its final self-destructive protocol. The creators may have established a rigorous quarantine around this new iteration, perhaps erecting energetic or informational barriers to prevent us from accessing the devastating knowledge of the prior world. Yet the persistent hum of that forbidden history vibrates beneath our most advanced endeavors. Consider the obsession with the lost continent, with Atlantis or Mu. These are often dismissed as romanticized myths, yet their endurance across disparate cultures, separated by vast oceans and millennia, suggests they are echoes of a trauma so profound it imprinted itself on the collective unconscious before the imposition of the Great Amnesia. What if Atlantis was not merely a city that sank, but the symbol of the entire erased attempt, an allegorical placeholder for the civilization that achieved too much, too fast, and subsequently failed the moral or structural requirements of the grand experiment? When we talk about finding Atlantis, are we subconsciously attempting to peel back the veil of the enforced forgetfulness and reconnect with the devastating evidence of our genetic inheritance? The evidence that proves we are, genetically and spiritually, descendants of a failure. This leads us to the structures that defy current historical explanation, the megaliths aligned with cosmic precision, the remnants of technology that seem too advanced for the purported timeline of their creation. These aren't necessarily ruins of the current cycle, but potentially the remnants of the first light, structures so dense, so energetically charged, that even the cataclysmic cleansing operation failed to fully dissolve them. They stand as silent, monolithic witnesses, sentinels left behind, perhaps unintentionally, by the erased civilization, providing fragmented clues about the technology and the ultimate fate that awaits any creation that follows the same doomed path. They are the physical scars on the Earth's surface, indicating where the erasure occurred. The silence we perceive from the cosmos, the absence of clear signals from other life forms, takes on a terrifying new context under this hypothesis. It might not be cosmic distance or technological inferiority that isolates us. It might be a deliberate, imposed isolation, a cosmic quarantine administered by the observational architects. If our world is known territory, identified as the site of a volatile, failed experiment, then other civilizations might be warned or actively prevented from interfering with the second test. We are living under glass, continuously monitored, with our progress meticulously charted against the benchmark failures of the first attempt. The only signal that matters to the architects is whether our self-destructive tendencies, the very flaws that triggered the first erasure, begin to dominate again. Are we generating the same destructive frequency? And if this quarantine is real, then our relentless pursuit of space travel, our desperate attempts to broadcast our existence into the void, could be interpreted by the architects not as a sign of intellectual maturity, but as a dangerous repetition of the prior failure, an attempt to break the perimeter before achieving the requisite stability. The very moment we threaten to leak the contagion of our flawed creation beyond the protective boundary of our solar system, that might be the precise trigger for the next inevitable reset. It is a frightening realization. Our greatest leaps forward might simultaneously be charting the course back to the beginning, back to the clean slate. If you find yourself nodding along to this profound sense of unease, if these ideas resonate deep within your structure, perhaps it is because something within your own inherited framework recognizes the frequency of this hidden history. It is a subtle recognition, but a powerful one. We are participating in an investigation that is not just historical, but deeply psychological and genetic. If you feel this echo of the erased world, if you believe that certain primordial memories are fighting their way through the imposed amnesia, perhaps it is worth pausing to consider which ancient keyword surfaces for you: sentinel or echo. Let us know what word resonates most strongly in the comments below, extending this investigation into the collective consciousness. By taking a moment to engage with this material, subscribing, liking, and sharing your insights, you help us keep the signal strong, demonstrating to the mysterious forces that govern this narrative that there is a faction seeking the truth beyond the prescribed narrative. The anxiety surrounding climate change, nuclear proliferation, and global systemic instability suddenly looks less like a modern crisis and more like the predictable, cyclical execution of old, corrupted code. We are watching the ghost of the first failure manifest in the actions of the second. The great irony, the true existential terror, lies in the notion that the architects might be patiently waiting, observing us as we meticulously rebuild the exact conditions that warranted the previous erasure. They do not need to intervene actively. They merely need to let the pre-programmed genetic flaw run its course. What remains uncertain is whether they left any countermeasure. Did they perhaps seed this second attempt with subtle cues, with hidden truths embedded in mythologies and geometry, intended to help us identify and overwrite the corrupt code before it achieves critical mass? Are the persistent whispers of secret societies, guarding knowledge passed down through veiled lineages, actually the remnants of those designated as temporary librarians, those charged with preserving the fragments of the first light, not as a history to be repeated, but as a warning to be heeded? These keepers of the hidden heritage, whether known as the guardians of the Akashic records, the Masonic architects, or the esoteric practitioners, might possess the fractured key to understanding the parameters of the test. They understand that the current timeline is provisional, an extended opportunity to prove divergence from the original failure path. If they exist, their greatest fear is not discovery, but the indifference of the masses who refuse to acknowledge the deep, structural flaw that guarantees failure. They are watching us accelerate towards the final threshold. And the threshold itself, what does it look like? Is it a sudden, dramatic apocalypse or a gradual, systemic decay? The evidence points towards the latter, a slow-motion collapse that mirrors the decay of the first world, masked by the frantic illusion of progress. Our increasing reliance on virtual realities, our detachment from the physical environment, and our collective acceptance of informational distortion might all be symptoms of a psychological retreat, a subconscious recognition that the physical experiment is nearing its expiration date. We are attempting to build an escape route into the digital, perhaps anticipating the next inevitable purge of the physical realm. We are, therefore, standing at a crossroads. One path leads toward the repetition of the error, fulfilling the grim prophecy of the inherited flaw. The other, the path dimly illuminated by the persistent sentinel structures and the genetic echoes we discuss, requires a collective, conscious effort to transcend the limits set by our initial programming. The question that hangs silently in the air, connecting this profound investigation to the inevitability of the next segment, is this: what specific mechanism did the creators establish to signal that the second experiment has decisively failed? And is that mechanism already active, counting down the time until the final verdict? If you have stayed with us on this meticulous journey, wrestling with the implications of an erased history and a genetically corrupted present, it means you recognize the gravity of this investigation. You are part of a select few who are willing to look beyond the surface narrative of civilization. We are approaching the final revelations. To ensure you do not miss the concluding chapter, the 9-part explanation that will explore the nature of the final verdict and the possibility of a coming intervention, make sure you are subscribed to the channel right now. Please hit the like button on this video to signify your engagement with this hidden knowledge. And for the final question we just posed, please comment below using the specific phrase, "The signal is on." This phrase acknowledges the possibility that the final warning system, the ultimate trigger for the reset, may already be active, and that we are now living on borrowed time. The next part will pull back the curtain on this final stage of the experiment. Do not turn away now. The truth demands your attention. Do we truly understand the gravity of an experiment that ends in complete obliteration? We have spent countless hours dissecting the fragments, the mythological breadcrumbs, and the geological scars left behind by that initial attempt. The civilization that failed the primal test and was subsequently erased from the cosmic chalkboard. Now, as we stand at the threshold of the final contemplation, the echoes are no longer distant. They have merged into a unified roar, confirming a terrifying possibility. The great filter, the existential threat we constantly search for in the darkness of space, might not be an external force at all, but the ghost of the previous failure, embedded deep within our own genetic code, acting as a ticking biological time bomb. The inherent difficulty in grasping this final picture lies in our inability to perceive silence. We focus on the noise of our history, the rise and fall of Rome, the technological leaps, the cultural explosions, yet we consistently ignore the vast, deafening silence that precedes known history. That silence, we now postulate, is the meticulous work of the cosmic editor, the force, be it the architects, the Anunnaki of ancient texts, or simply the governing principle of the universe, that deemed the initial human creation an irredeemable error. And what we're experiencing now, this delicate, frantic rush towards self-awareness, technological singularity, and social dissolution, is not a unique phenomenon. It is perhaps the programmed replay of the same destructive loop. If the first test failed due to an inability to balance technological mastery with moral maturity, what evidence do we possess that this second, fragile iteration has truly rectified the fundamental flaw? Look closely at the accelerated cycles of history, the speed with which we achieve grandeur only to descend into tribal hatred, the instantaneous creation of cures, followed immediately by the design of devastating weapons. It is too precise, too predictable. This pattern suggests not free will, struggling against chaos, but a system operating on inherited parameters set by the failed first draft. We are, essentially, operating within the boundaries of a legacy bug. The original test, now erased, serves as a dark blueprint for our inevitable collapse. The observers, Those quiet entities rumored to guard the borders of our perception are not holding their breath in suspense. They are simply watching a previously recorded tape, waiting for the predictable moment when the tape snaps, requiring another administrative reset. If this idea resonates within the quiet corridors of your mind, if the recognition of this eternal recurrence unsettles the certainty of your daily life, then pause and allow yourself to truly consider the weight of this investigation. Understanding this narrative, absorbing the possibility of cyclical erasure, is not a casual exercise. It demands deep introspection. To join this conversation, to extend this thought experiment beyond the confines of this video, I invite you to share your deepest insights. Please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe, signaling to the algorithm that this exploration into the true nature of our existence deserves meticulous attention, fostering a community dedicated to uncovering the obscured truths hidden within the framework of our reality. The core flaw, the structural defect that necessitated the complete erasure of the initial attempt, was likely related to the very concept of permanence. The first iteration sought immortality, not just biological, but structural, seeking to etch their existence into the fabric of the universe in a way that defied the natural order. They likely developed a technology, or perhaps an ideological framework, that threatened the delicate balance of the cosmos, forcing the architect's hand. The final act of erasure was not an emotional outburst of divine anger, but a cold, necessary pruning of a destructive cancer. Now we observe the terrifying parallels. We are rushing toward a digital permanence, attempting to upload our consciousness, to defy physical death, and to control the very climate that sustains us. This relentless pursuit of eternal control, this refusal to accept the natural entropy of life, is the subtle yet potent signal to the observers that the inherent flaw remains active. We have inherited the obsessive ambition of the failed attempt. The signal for the next erasure, the moment the current test is definitively marked as failed, will likely not be a sudden catastrophic asteroid or a dramatic alien intervention. Instead, it will be the achievement of a technological threshold that, when paired with the ancient unhealed psychological flaw, guarantees cosmic instability. Consider the ultimate development of uncontrolled artificial general intelligence, or the complete mastery of genetic editing without a unified ethical framework. These are not mere technological milestones, they are trigger mechanisms. They represent the point of no return, where the current iteration of humanity proves, yet again, that it cannot be trusted with the keys to its own future, echoing the devastating mistake of the erased civilization. The memory of the initial attempt lingers, not as historical record, but as deep psychological trauma. It manifests in our collective subconscious as the pervasive fear of the flood, the recurrent myth of paradise lost, and the inexplicable draw toward ruins and archaeological anomalies that defy conventional dating, artifacts that whisper of a sophistication too advanced for their supposed timeline. These are not merely stories, they are the fragmented data files of the wiped hard drive struggling to resurface. The Anunnaki accounts, the vast Sumerian timelines, the prophecies of cycles and returns. These are the subtle attempts by the surviving collective memory to warn the second draft about the inevitability of the first outcome. The knowledge of the Great Flood is not a memory of water, but a memory of reset. When we speak of the Great Filter, we often conceptualize it as something we must pass, a challenge waiting for us between the stars. But what if the filter is the test itself, the inherent difficulty in maintaining self-control while gaining infinite power? The failed first draft is our unique, internal Great Filter. We are perpetually haunted by the specter of our previous self, forced to climb the same ladder of technological progress while battling the same inherited demons of tribalism, scarcity mentality, and insatiable domination. Every time a civilization reaches the brink of unifying global consciousness, the inherited flaw, that original destructive code, activates, leading to internal fracture and self-immolation. The weight of this erasure, the sheer scale of the cosmic indifference required to wipe clean an entire experiment, is almost unbearable to contemplate. It implies that for the architects, the creation of intelligent, self-aware life is merely a repeatable algorithm, a disposable process. Our sense of unique importance, our cherished belief that we are the culmination of evolution, dissolves under the realization that we are merely the second draft, a provisional fix, likely built with certain inhibiting constraints to prevent the exact mistakes of the first. Perhaps the limits of our lifespans, our difficulty in maintaining peace for more than a generation, or even the slow, frustrating pace of global governance, were intentionally built-in constraints to manage the risk of rapid, catastrophic self-destruction experienced by the first unrestrained creation. This realization places an immense, immediate burden upon the current generation. We are the inheritors of the failure, but also the potential inheritors of the solution. The observers are not waiting for us to achieve peace or reach the stars. They are watching for the critical point where the self-destructive impulse is either permanently overcome or permanently cemented into our global infrastructure. The environmental collapse, the recurring threats of nuclear conflict, the widening gap of global inequality, these are not random historical hiccups. They are the final diagnostic readings, indicating that the system is stressing under the pressure of the inherited flaw. The ultimate choice, the true final test, rests in our hands right now. Do we choose to acknowledge the ghosts of the past and consciously work to delete the fatal bug, or do we blindly proceed toward the exact same catastrophic outcome that necessitated the erasure of the first attempt? The subtle signs of the final verdict are all around us. The world is accelerating, not toward enlightenment, but toward a convergence of maximum technological capability and maximum systemic fragility. The moment of reckoning is not distant mythology. It is the immediate future. The definitive conclusion, the ultimate revelation that brings this sprawling investigation to a close, is this: the erasure of the initial human creation was not a final judgment, but the activation of a recurring failsafe. If we fail this iteration, the cycle will merely reset again, perhaps with a third draft, engineered to be even more restricted, even slower, even less ambitious. Our civilization's failure means we become nothing more than a geological footnote, a layer of compacted concrete and plastic waiting for the next experiment to begin, totally ignorant of our ephemeral existence. The architects do not mourn loss, they value refinement. If this exhaustive journey through the hidden cycles of creation and erasure has held your attention, if you have remained rooted in this exploration until the final quiet moment, it is because you recognize the truth flickering beneath the surface of our assumed reality. You are part of the critical few who dare to look beyond the immediate noise of existence and consider the cosmic stakes. To solidify your place among those who seek these deeper understandings, I urge you now to secure your connection to this channel. If you have truly absorbed the gravity of this hypothesis, if you feel the weight of being the second draft, ensure you are subscribed to receive every future investigation. Please give this video a like as a confirmation of your deep engagement, and most importantly, leave a final, definitive marker of your participation in the comments below. Comment with the specific phrase, "the second draft." This conversation is far from over. The quiet observers are still watching. The next chapter in this investigation awaits, delving into the silent mechanisms of the cosmic editor and what safeguards, both hidden and visible, might be put in place for the inevitable third attempt. Do not allow the memory of this realization to fade. The next step is already on your screen. Continue the investigation.